I'm Deani VanPelt. I'm from just outside of Toronto in Canada and living here in the UK for 5 weeks. So absolutely delighted to have a panel today of four researchers who all come to us from the UK. So we are going to begin our session. We will have 20 minutes for each presentation and Q&A as part of that presentation, and we will begin with Harriet Pattison, who is a senior lecturer at Liverpool Hope University.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming to this session. So yes, what I want to talk to you about in this session is some recent research which I've carried out with a colleague from Liverpool Hope University about Christian home education in the UK. And this is a specific section of or sector of home education that hasn't been looked at in research at all. As far as I know, we are the first people to have a research look at that in this country. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the work of Will Kimlicker as a lens through which to consider Christian home education with the kind of the exploratory question of what is the entitlement of parents to bring their children up to home educate them in their faith, and what are the stipulations for autonomy for those children to make their own religious choices. So has anybody heard of Will Kimlicker? Is anybody familiar with his work? No? Okay, so Kimlicker is a Canadian political philosopher, and his particular area of expertise, his focus, is the question of minority groups in pluralistic societies. And he started off with Indigenous groups in Canada, and how are they located in Canadian politics and Canadian society? And his ideas are very well founded, and they've been used not just in Canada, but in other countries and in other contexts. So I thought that they would make a good framework for thinking about this issue of Christian home education. So the start of this research was that my colleague and I, Sarah and I, were approached by some Christian home educating groups. So I was kind of the home education hat on a published work on home education, and Sarah, her research issue is children's spirituality. So we made a good team to address this particular problem, and it was set in motion by the schools bill. So if you've been talking to English home educators while you have been here, even if you're not from England yourself, the subject of the schools bill has probably come up because it was this enormous piece of legislation coming down the tracks 2021, 2022, and it was causing a real furore amongst home educators. It wanted to bring in changes to primary legislation that would really alter the position of home education in the law. Amongst other concerns was the compulsory register, which has been sort of bubbling away in the background of English home education legislation for a long time. It also was going to make fundamental changes to school attendance orders, and it wasn't just in the data collection. It was going to allow the government to have wide-ranging data collection, unspecified data collection rights. So they were all very worrying things. For the Christian home educators and for other parents as well, this wasn't an exclusively Christian issue. But they felt it wasn't just what was in the bill itself, it was the gateway that the bill would open up for other changes to home education, and particularly the balance of power between the state and parents in deciding what education for a particular family, for particular children, was going to be. And as I say, that was a concern that a lot of home educators felt. For the Christians, it had an extra particular edge to it, and that was their worry that it was going to interfere with what they saw as their biblical obligations, their Christian obligations to bring their children up in their faith, and they were worried that this was going to be seen as being unacceptable by authorities. So it wouldn't just be their education, it would be the enactment of their religious practices that would be impacted if the schools bill went through. And so we were contacted by a number of, we were contacted by 2 or 3 home educating Christian groups who had got together and were concerned about this and asked us if we would do some research around it. So we held a focus group with the people who had approached us and some other Christian home educating groups, and on the basis of the focus group, we drew up an online survey which we disseminated through those groups. And obviously Brian was talking in a talk earlier today about all research has its limitations. You know, if we wanted to discuss the limitations of this research, we would go back to that sample as one thing to discuss. We had 462 participants. We gave them a barrage of questions, not quite was it the 86 that Catherine Sunshine? Wasn't quite that many. Was a lot of questions. And as I say, I've been using Will Kimlicker's thesis on minority rights to think about what we do with the data or where we take that next. So, I mean, these people had come to us because they were worried, and we could see that, looking at the data when we asked them about their identification as Christian home educators, we could see that their self-perception was that they were a very marginalised group, largely overlooked and misunderstood. So you can see there, nearly all of a majority of them felt that Christian home educators were viewed negatively in society. A few didn't know or weren't sure, didn't want to commit, but only 5 thought this is a positive label to have. This is something that is good, that people are going to get a good reaction out of people when we say we're Christian and we're home educating. They were very worried about the schools bill. They were worried that it didn't understand, that it would not uphold, and indeed that it would undermine the Christian values on which their education was based. And they thought that overall it would be a very detrimental picture of what they wanted to do. So Kimlicker has got kind of 2 sides to his argument about minority groups in society, or 2 facets that we need to hold together and to look at in tandem over the issue of minority rights in pluralistic societies. And the first of these is to do with the external protection of those groups. So Kimlicker's thesis is that these groups must have the kind of protection that they need from wider society in order to carry out their way of life, their traditions, their beliefs, their culture, enact their heritage. And he says that there has to be a mechanism within society to allow that to function, so that the minority groups, whatever they are, whether they're Indigenous Canadians or, as in this case, a minority religious group, they must be accorded that protection by wider society. When we looked at the things that the Christian home educators were telling us, one of the things that we needed to establish was that this was a particular group, that these weren't people who were home educating and happened to be Christian, that being Christian and a home educator, a Christian home educator, was an actual identity and not 2 things that just happened to be overlapping. And we received a very strong sense of that. And we also received a very strong sense from the things that people told us, that they felt in need of external protection, that they felt marginalised, they felt that the rest of society didn't notice them, wasn't bothered about them, didn't know that they existed. They felt that where they were noticed, they were politicised, and some of the language was quite extreme, that people were telling us as being seen as bigots, being seen as intolerant, being seen as spreading hate or spreading lies in society. And these were all things that the Christian home educators had heard or had picked up about the way that they were being spoken about or reported about, where Christian home education was highlighted. And there was also this perception of risk, that Christians wanted to keep their children at home. They wanted to keep them out of mainstream society. They wanted to keep them away from the ideas of mainstream society and indoctrinate them, make sure that there was no alternative in front of them apart from to grow up in their parents' faith. So there was a lot of risk associated with it. And prior to this, I did do a little bit of research with Muslim home educators. And interestingly, they were saying exactly the same things. This is how we're perceived. We're perceived as being a risk. We're a risk to our own children, and we're a risk to wider society. And that was being echoed by the Christians. And they felt as well that there were I don't want to say lies, but particular narratives about what they were doing that were promulgated through the media, through the press, through sort of political remarks occasionally that positioned them in that way. So the sum was that we felt that there was a strong enough argument, and we have got a paper on this, so it's a more developed argument than I've just given you, but we felt that there were grounds for arguing that this is a minority group who would answer to Kimlicker's criteria for external protection. So the other side of this that Kimlicker is concerned about is internal restrictions. So he says, if a group needs external protection, it doesn't necessarily follow that they will internally restrict their members, but they may do, and that situation needs to be opened up and examined. So when he talks about internal restriction in the Canadian Indigenous groups, he's talking about things like gender-sanctioned violence or forced marriage. Interestingly, I think a lot of the criticism that's levelled, sometimes at home education in general and some particularly at Christian home education or religious home education, falls under this kind of idea of internal restriction, that children being educated in that way will not have access to the ideas, the resources, the opportunities in mainstream society, and that will be a deliberate part of their education, will be restricting them from those. Now, these ideas, they're not very well articulated so far in this country, but I think we're familiar with those criticisms from other places, from the United States and from other places. So some of you might be aware of the work of Catherine Ross, who's argued that religious and its Christian home education in the United States that she talks about denies children exposure to the democratic values of society. She also argues that it reduces children's tolerance to other points of view and to other lifestyles, and generally it's LGBTQ issues that get spoken about in that context, that children are brought up to believe that homosexuality is wrong and that doesn't accord with mainstream society's views. Casito, who was researching Seventh-day Adventist home educators in Finland, talked about the way that they were charged with indoctrinating rather than educating their children. Elizabeth Bartolet, that curricula are restricted, that religious home education will only allow their children to come in contact with specific ideas and not with the full range that would appear on a school curriculum. And Beck, that it undermines children's access to particular kinds of childhood, to particular normalised childhoods in the society in which they grow up. So if we apply these to Kimlicker's theory and think, okay, how do we fit this into the ideas of internal restriction? What kind of things would we discover from the Christian home educators? The first one of those, proselytization, this is part of the freedom of minority groups. They should be free to talk about their culture, their heritage, their religion in this case. They should be to Kimlicker's thesis, they are not enjoying the external protections to practice their own faith. And the Christian parents were very clear that not being able to bring their children up in their faith was not just something that affected the education of their children, it was something that affected them in enacting their religion. This was part of their faith beliefs that they needed to do this. So it was a question of a fundamental meaning in their own lives that would have been stopped without that. So they should be free to do that. But alongside that, there was the need, and again, Kimlicker is very clear about this, there is a need for the wherewithal for members of the minority group to question the lifestyle that they're being brought up in or the lifestyle of their heritage group. And in order to do that, they have to have access to ideas that could be used for questioning it. If that's all you've ever heard, there is nothing on the outside with which you can ask these questions. And parents we didn't ask parents directly, would you allow your children to question? Because, obviously that's a very leading question, but we did ask them open questions about their priorities in education, about their motives for home education, about their curriculum, and about, their lifestyle in general. And a lot of the parents did spontaneously, open-ended questions, say that it was very important for them that their children had the opportunity to access other ideas, be familiar with other thoughts, know what children in school were learning, know what was different about why they were learning it. And behind that, there kind of lay a deeper reason about faith, with the Christian parents arguing, you can't inherit your religion. It has to be something that you have to take, an individual has to take ownership of for themselves. You have to know what you believe and why you believe it. You have to be able to stand up for your own lifestyle, for your own faith, in order for that faith to have any depth, in order for it to have any meaning. So they really wanted that for their children. And the other freedom that they needed, and again, this is part of Kimlicker's thesis, is that there needs to be the autonomy in minority groups for members to leave. They need to have a clear way of exiting from the group if that is what they decide to do. So obviously we're talking about children. So that's got to be kind of sewn into an education and a lifestyle. But again, parents were very clear. We don't want to impose this on our children. If they decide differently, that's fine by us, but they have had the chance to see our faith, and that's what that's what we need to do for them. But if they decide they don't want to do that, then that's fine by us. So, in terms of internal restriction, then we felt that whilst there was no guarantee, the fact that these parents demonstrated that they were aware of the idea of internal restrictions, and that they wanted to ensure that they didn't inhibit their children through internal restrictions. There's obviously no guarantee in a wider sense outside our sample that parents weren't doing this, or that possibility doesn't exist, because it obviously does. But what it does show is that it is possible for a Christian home education to answer to those criteria. So it shows that it is possible. One of the things, just really quickly, that and I was really interested in this because, again, when I did some research with Muslim families, this point came up as well. And people were saying, the rest of the world looks at us and they think we're very narrow-minded, that all we do is adhere to doctrines, that we don't really think about things, and that we indoctrinate our children. But actually, when we look outside, we see that is what people are doing in mainstream society. And actually what we are doing is much wider than that. We are going into, as this parent says here, we are going into subjects that don't get touched at school. We are going into levels of thinking that don't get touched at school. We are asking really deep questions, not just about faith, but about history and about philosophy, about epistemology, about all sorts of things which don't get touched in school. So this is a very wide-ranging and very deep education. It's just different. So this question at the top, this came from a researcher looking at Christian education, not home education, in the 2000s, with the argument that Christianity was being squeezed out of the English curriculum in favour of a kind of a learning about the major world religions, and that this was undermining Christian families' faith education in schools. And this sort of attitude that's encapsulated in that question about, should Christian families have their values marginalised, squeezed out of the way by anything that the state happens to choose, because the state can come from anywhere with its ideas about education. I think that feeling, whilst it was expressed a lot, is maybe a bit of a narrow way of looking at this issue, and that perhaps to get a wider grasp on it going forwards, it would perhaps serve us to think about Christian home education not as something that is unique, but as an illustration of the argument. And that gives us legs, that gives the Kimlicker thesis legs to say, right, this is a frame through which we could profitably look at this, a framework for argument. One of the things that has happened in England and in the UK in general, I think, is that the debate about home education has become increasingly polemic. With people just simply arguing, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm right, you're wrong. And that using a framework like Kimlicker gives us an opportunity to rethink our positions in that, and to think about, well, what are the parameters? What is it that we're trying to achieve here? What are the parameters in which we can locate these arguments and this information? Something else that's really interesting here, thinking back to the situation with Muslim families who were home educating, there was very much a narrative. This was after terrorist attacks in London and fears about homegrown terror, the Prevent programme, fundamental British values. There was a very strong political narrative about national belonging. And if you live in this country, you have to join into this project of national belonging. It's a difficult argument to put onto the Christian home educators, because whilst, church attendance and numbers of people identifying as Christians in this country has been in steady decline for a long time, this is still fundamentally a Christian country. Our institutions, our way of life, our espoused values, our monarchy, etc., all have very strong Christian roots. So it's much harder to say to the Christian home educators, it's you who don't belong here. And thirdly, and I think this is a major point through through a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of the concerns that I've heard so far in the conference and which really occupy me as well, is that the default in all of these questions is legislation. Oh, we'll just bring in some more legislation. We'll bring in the schools bill, and that is what we really need, is to have the public discussions, the public debates, maybe using things like Kimlicka, using theses like Kimlicka to try and get a better handle on where we're going here, rather than to default back to legislation every time. So I think I'm out of time.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
We do have time for one question.
Okay.
Yes?
Hi, thank you. I wondered whether in either the focus group or the survey there were any questions around church-maintained schools, because obviously there are still large numbers of schools that say they live out the Christian values through the curriculum.
Yeah, we didn't ask that directly, but we did have a lot of parents tell us Christian schools aren't really Christian. Christian schools aren't doing what we want. What we want, they're not, and there is a lot in the literature too about, what you might sort of bluntly call the watering down of Christian schools, even though Christian schools do have a lot of say over what they do and how they do it. For this particular group of Christian parents, it wasn't reflecting faith in the way that they wanted it to.
And we're just passing around a beautiful summary of this research. So thank you.
Yeah, we've got a
very
little
much.
report, so yeah.
We've got a few more here if you didn't receive one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Harriet, we really appreciate that.
Pass that on, or?
Our next presenter is Robert Taylor, home educating parent, researcher, educator, and we look forward to hearing your work. Open University, UK?
Yes. Hello everyone, I'm Robert Taylor from the Open University, and today I'm going to be talking about reflexivity in my home education research project. I'm going to be reflecting on my roles as a home educating father, a teacher and a researcher. And I'll start by talking a bit about my project, why I think reflexivity might be important for that, and then give some examples. So reflexivity can be reflecting on our own practice, our own research, and our position in that research. It's important for lots of practitioners, but I'll go into some reasons why it might be important for mine. So my title is Exploring Students' Transitions from Home Education to University. So being a home educator, working as a tutor in the university, I felt I might be well placed, but also might have to be aware of my position, my closeness to the subject and perhaps the participants. Also, methodologically, there might be some reasons to reflect on my work. So my approach is interpretivist and also practitioner research. I'm doing a doctorate in education, so it requires thinking about your kind of professional practice, perhaps more so than a PhD. And also, I'm part-time, so I'm going to split between the two places. I should also say, yeah, I'm in my third year, so I don't have all my data yet. This is work in progress. Also, I've got a small sample, so it's small-scale qualitative research. I've only got 12 participants, so I'm looking for depth, not breadth. I'm using semi-structured, qualitative, one-to-one interviews. Online, I'm doing serial interviews. So my first interview is the longer one, and from those I try to elicit a sort of narrative of the student's journey to and through home education and onto university. And my data analysis, I'm using reflexive thematic analysis and narrative analysis. So another reason that reflexivity might be important is because of the insider and outsider debate in home education. I think a lot of home educators and researchers might want to know about the researcher's background or their position or their sort of relation and motivation within the subject. At the beginning, I described myself as an insider. As I've gone through the project, I thought more about that, maybe that there isn't just one home education community, there might be several, and that maybe you can't be in all of them, or that there might be similarities and we have things in common, which is nice. And the importance of reflexive methods is because we're relying on the participants' subjective experiences and the researchers' interpretations, their subjectivity. We need to know that those interpretations are credible, authentic, and trustworthy, and that can be achieved through reflexivity. Olmos Vega and colleagues defined reflexivity as a set of continuous, collaborative, and multifaceted practices through which researchers self-consciously critique, appraise, and evaluate how their subjectivity and context influence the research process. And I think that covers a lot of ground, and it's perhaps more an aim for researchers. I don't think we can ever fully reflect on all our identities and all our positions, so perhaps we have to present the ones that are most relevant, the ones that we feel are relevant. Some of the methods for sort of accessing our own inner world, our own position. I use a researcher journal. I think lots of researchers do. And I combine that with memos. So after an interview, I write a little memo about my experience of it, my thoughts, perhaps what the atmosphere was like, what I felt during it, what I imagine how they might have experienced it. And also using documents and photography in my own practice. I've also had self-interviews, so that's when the researcher is interviewed, perhaps by a colleague or a peer or another researcher. And after interviews, I've been writing social maps. Some of the levels of reflexivity I'm trying to access are my personal experience, trying to think about my values and beliefs, also thinking about the context that we practice in. And I suppose I have 2 or 3 contexts in that. I can also reflect on the methods, why we've chosen them, why they might be appropriate, and also then interpersonal reflections about the research process. So firstly, this is got some of the detail out of the way. A bit more about me, reflecting on my own experience. I think it's been quite nice for me, and I think it's helped me grow as a home educator. So my wife Grace and I, we home educate our 2 children. Florence is 9, my daughter, and my son Barney, he's 12. And the photos I picked, they're quite positive. I think anyone who's been homeschooling or home education probably knows there's good and bad days. But as I'm looking at kind of my values and my ideals, I thought that's fair enough. So my daughter, she really likes learning about animals. She's got lots of pet cats. She learns about cats and dogs and horses and things. And my son, he really likes computers, technology, video games, things like that. And I've tried to think about where I might kind of place myself or what practices we use in home education. So we do a mixture of like one-to-one learning on the left-hand side, at home or in the park, group learning in the library. And then this one I was running a reading group for my son and his friends. So that kind of links to sort of local networks and local groups. We read The Iron Man. I think we built an Iron Man out of junk. I also have my professional role to think about. So I'm a tutor and advisor at my local university, and that's Liverpool, but I'm doing my doctorate at the Open University, so I've kind of got the two different worlds and two different groups of colleagues to think about. And also, yeah, when I find time, I'm also researching. So through the researcher interview, I've looked at my values and beliefs, and then I've tried to link these to my professional practice. So for instance, the UK Advisory and Tutoring Association have their sort of 8 core values, and I've emboldened the ones that I think particularly resonated with me, which was being empathetic, inclusive, and student-centred. And I think they cross over with home education, I imagine. The other place I look for values maybe is with the British Educational Researcher Association. They ask for an ethic of respect. Also, the institutions I'm working at have their own teacher standards, their own codes of practice, their own ethical boards. Luckily, these kind of cross over. So I'm thinking it's important to be respectful and consider our participants at all times. Thinking a bit about the context, the sort of a social policy or the legal context, I think Harriet touched on this as well. The Education Select Committee produced the Strengthening Home Education report, and though I didn't agree with the recommendations or their observations, one I could that did resonate with me. They said, we want to see a level playing field for electively home-educated children and young people when it comes to public examinations. And with those in EHE extended the same access to further education and work opportunities as their schooled peers. And I think that's probably something lots of people working in higher education could agree with. They also called for more data and more the voices of young people. Doing the literature review, I found some of our colleagues' works like Ari and Oz and Ray. And I know in the UK, exam and qualification access has been a really important issue, especially during and then since COVID. And Merritt and et al. And Finlayson have been looking at that. Thinking more holistically about students' experiences, I've looked at transitions to adulthood and employment, like Govertz and Barrow, and Webb, Nelson and Wheeler. What I wanted to do in my research, using narrative, I wanted to kind of build like holistic pictures of the students, look at the sense of chronology and order, the contingency in their choices, and how they kind of moved through that period and how they understood it. So I've sampled students from 3 points: applicants before university, students at university, and then graduates after university. I'll just talk through this one quickly. So I do a first in-depth interview, then I do my reflections, the memo and the social map, and that will yield an interview transcript. And from that, I can draft a narrative of their experience. To make sure that that narrative is shared or reflected by the participant, I could do a follow-up interview. And again, that once I've got the final narrative and the final transcript, I can move on to thematic analysis and narrative analysis. The social maps I was talking about, Jacobson and Mustafa, they suggested 8 sort of demographic characteristics that you and your participants could reflect on. And I've added one about educational background, because I think that's more particularly pertinent to this case. So in the boxes, you can put your age, your participant's age, and then reflect on how that might affect your interpretations of the project. So I'm using Brown and Clark for the reflexive thematic analysis across cases, and Nishida et al. For the within cases narrative analysis. It's not an evaluative project of home education, but lots of the students talked about their perceptions of it, their experience of it. And Maxim's a young man, he's studying maths, and he was always home educated. And his view was about home education: you can choose whatever subjects you want to do so you can play to your strengths. And it was nice to see through his career, he was really interested in kind of mathematical video games, joined maths competitions, and then went on to study maths at university. When he talked about his transition to university, he said, I think it was pretty smooth. And in general, I mean, the university did have a system in place for it. So very clearly they were prepared for these kinds of students. Started drawing a diagram and it got very complicated, I found quite quickly, because the transitions were simultaneous rather than consecutive. But starting at the top, I found while they were in home education, they were also developing their hobbies and interests, and lots of them were also working, a mixture of sort of work in and around the house and work in sort of local groups and things that they were interested in. And it was nice to see how they developed their interests into study and into work. And two nice examples I have. One from Anne. She wrote, when I was about 13, I got given a pony. And that was like my thing that I wanted to do in life, have a pony. And then my mother was like, well, that's fine, you can, but you can find a job to look after the pony. I was like, okay, well, what we're going to do? So, you know, you end up with like a gardening job and helping out in the yard to afford to keep it. And then she was like, you can also do the books. So you can work out what you earn and what you spend and then keep a record of it all. And I like this story. It seemed to combine her interests with cross-curricular learning in maths and financial literacy, encouraged by her mum, which I think we could sympathise with that. And another student in the study also really liked horses. Jane said the horses were definitely it, because if I were at school, we wouldn't have had the opportunities that we did to be around them as much as we were. And then she went back to work there later. I went back years later to work, you know, and I met some of the people that I knew from back then. So it was quite funny, really. And what interested me in this one was that she could combine sort of social opportunities, work opportunities, and her interests. And I thought these two really stuck out to me. I wondered why that was. And it was because of my daughter. My daughter really likes horses, and my son also. And I think this is similar to the landscape around the Northwest. And they wouldn't have had these opportunities if they'd been at school. But I do need to be mindful not to put too many of my own interpretations and my own experiences onto those. That said, the students in the study were really interested in my motivations and experiences. And Anne remarked, when you said you were home educating your son, straight away I was like, is that because you want to know what it's like for them when they go to university? And I guess it is. And also our commitments to sort of the wider home education community. So to conclude, reflecting on the sort of 3 different practices I do, I think the connecting themes between them are the overlapping of work, study, hobbies, and family life, and the opportunities across those, and also the importance in when working with young people, working with your own children, working with research participants, that we display empathy, listening, and encouragement. Here are my references. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Robert. We have time for questions.
Hi, Robert. Thanks. That's very fascinating for a number of reasons. I wanted to get your feedback on a comment. It seems to me that what you are discovering in your meeting with these students is that learning is just contextualized, that it is just organic in their lives. And I think that's missing in the literature. I think in a conventional way, it's decontextualized, you know? And it's kind of part of the disconnect that we have in interpreting our experience, home educating our own kids with the broader society, because they only think of school as being this very compartmentalized thing. And I just wonder if you could expound a little bit on the themes that you found related to that.
Yeah, that's a great point. One thing I found in coding the data was that, for instance, the story with the horses and the work, the socializing, it seemed to hit lots of boxes. And that maybe looking at the narrative journey, looking how those come out across time might be able to pull more out of it, or accept that, yeah, it is all entangled. We can't sort of separate, I don't know, family life, social life, and education when they're sort of organically and sort of dynamically interacting. Oh.
Well, I think that's a key point to emphasize, in your outcome.
Yeah.
I myself have done some qualitative research, and I know it was very hard to what box do I put this response into?
Yeah.
Because it checks so many.
Yeah, and I think the sort of producing something like a narrative which a reader could enjoy and see how those interact really works. Thanks.
Question here.
Hi, I'm Anne Charles. I'm not a researcher, so this is a question more about research and the way biases are handled. Because I work a lot with researchers, and I've noticed that when it comes to home education research, there is this expectation that if you're a home educating person and researching, you have to do a lot of work on biases. There'll be conference topics about it. You've done this lovely presentation here. Is that a common culture? Is that something that's also commonly discussed and expected and pulled apart for people who are doing school research, who went to school? Or is it another kind of example of bias coming through that home educators are expected to self-reflect more and more than the kind of prevailing culture?
Yeah, so I think reflexivity is used widely, but I think there's an extra expectation on home education researchers to perhaps justify their analysis that it's not just a reflection of their own biases. And I think you can go some way to do that. There might always be people who are skeptical, which is difficult, but I think if the work's persuasive, I think we'll be able to get there, hopefully. Thanks.
Thank you so very much for this.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is B. Stevenson. She's a doctoral candidate, research student at Oxford Brookes University. She's done a lot of work on various aspects of wellness. What jumped out at me is your work at Canterbury Christ Church University. So we look forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much. And I think my presentation actually segues really nicely from Robert's. I am also an EdD student in my third year, and I'm looking at discourses of home education in England and how they shape our understanding of the practice, but specifically with a view to comparing it to how school is talked about. So similar again to Robert, and actually to your recent question, I would say I'm an ex-teacher. I'm currently a school governor. My professional hat, I work with senior leadership teams and staff in schools to try and create really emotionally healthy cultures. And I home educated my own children for 2 years. They're now back in a local school. So I do have that similar kind of need to really reflect on all the different roles that I bring to my research. And my journey as a researcher began because of the global pandemic, like for so many home educators, and we've heard a lot through these presentations, that the growth in numbers of families choosing to home educate is rising exponentially, owing to, in many cases, the experiences that families had. Having said that, my children are back at a really interesting and very nurturing and caring, homely, if you like, state primary school very near our house. So I kind of can look at it from a number of different angles. So for the last 4 years, I've been on quite a journey, wearing all my different hats, going into school, spending a lot of time in school, spending a lot of time with the home education community. And that really led to me asking my questions about home education in England. So as I said, experiencing my own children's learning in lockdown threw all my preconceptions about education out the window. I'm a trained primary school teacher. I'd always been taught that I had to track to progress, that I had to teach particular content, and that I was looking towards specific targets and goals. And the 2 years I spent first in lockdown, but then afterwards when we kept our children at home, as I say, threw all of those preconceptions out the window, and I started asking the bigger questions about how children learn and thrive. So this excerpt is taken from an audio diary that I made through the lockdowns. As you can see, I was really keen to be reflexive through our decision to home educate our 3 children, who at the time were 6, 4, and 2. So in our decision to home educate our own children, our 3 children, one of the things I found really interesting was the responses that we had from family and friends. And for many people, I'm sure that that will be a familiar experience. It was at best viewed with suspicion, and at worst, kind of fears for the children's academic progress and well-being. And so I really wanted to interrogate some of those narratives. So that's where the kind of basis for my doctoral studies began. This simple mind map was sent out in advance of focus groups, which I'll talk about in a moment when I go into more depth about my research, asking parents. So I've done 2 focus groups of one of parents who home educate their children and one focus group of parents who have their children in school, asking them just to give those initial responses to these 3 words: education, home, and school, and either connect those thoughts if they want to, or not at all. So that was just a kind of preempt of the kinds of questions that we were going to ask in the focus group. So why now? Obviously, it's a really pivotal moment to be highlighting, or at least opening up to scrutiny, the normative and resistant discourses of education in England. So I'm building on the work of lots of brilliant researchers, many of whom are here today. And as I say, I think the global pandemic really did shift our particularly parent attitudes to learning. So I'm building on some of the work that Harriet has looked at in terms of those shifts in perceptions about the education system and what it means to be educated. So why go about doing this? I think, again, this has been covered by a number of the speakers today. It's currently, in England, at the least, quite an adversarial debate, and particularly the schools bill that Harriet has already talked about has led to a kind of increased demand from all political parties for increased regulation, and then some really kind of backlash against that, obviously, or kind of dialogue that's very resistant towards that increased regulation. So I feel like the research has a really important part to play in just opening up to scrutiny. What are the questions that we're not asking? What are the assumptions that are being made in order for us to see more clearly and kind of try and make the debate a little bit less polarised? So my approach then to my research study, my thesis, is I'm going to be taking some of Michael Foucault's, because obviously his body of work is huge, thinking, particularly his sort of archaeological approach to knowledge. So his concepts of truth and power and knowledge provide a way of thinking, or the methodology, if you like, about the phenomenon of home education, but they also provide the method, the tool, so the discourse analysis in which we can reveal some of those, or make clearer some of those discourses that there are around home education in the UK, particularly in its relation to schooling. So his approach to history and the present day is that careful analysis. He's looking for the norms of social and cultural practice that create the discourses of schooling, and then can be seen in our practices, like the fact that there are lots of children are at school, and the language that we then use to describe what we see. So we say school-aged children, for example. So my work is going to be 2-phase, and as Robert said, I'm in my 3rd year, so this is of a part-time doctorate, so this is going alongside my work in schools, so it's quite an interesting kind of parallel life that I'm living at the moment. So the first phase is a policy analysis. So actually looking at how home education is constructed through policy documentation. And then I have collected primary data through parent constructions of home education. As I said, I've done focus groups and interviews with both home educating and schooling parents. And I'm looking to see, are there reflections from the policy documentation in how home education is constructed in parent perceptions, and are there differences between home educating parents and schooling parents? So, according to Foucault, the systems of discourse create our understanding of the current context in which we live. So, through a systematic analysis of statements, I'm specifically looking at pulling out statements that construct ideas around home education from the document, as well as things that can't be said. So I'm also looking for what might be missing from the documentation in order to understand a bit more about what's not being asked, as I mentioned. So in order to discuss the existence of home education as a choice and as a legal right for parents, it has to be part of the discourses that we're analysing. So what does the discourse analysis of educational policy and non-government organisations, so I've looked at a couple of think tank documents about home education as well, what do they indicate about how it's constructed there? How is that then reflected in parents' constructions of formal schooling and home education? With the hope that the aim of the research is to increase our understanding of how they're informing the debate. So in order to kind of open it up for discussion and ask more questions. So with the caveat that these are very early findings, so I've done my policy analysis and I've started collecting the primary data, but similar to Robert, I'm in early stages. I will share with you some of the kind of key constructs, the groups of statements that are appearing through the policy analysis. So I've built a framework for analysis based on the work of Erebus Eilon and Walker-Dean, and also Kendall and Wickham. For those of you who are familiar with Foucault's work, Kendall and Wickham provide a very key text around how to use his methods. I'm loosely journeying through 6 phases of analysis. So the first is that I'm collecting those statements. I'm looking through, first of all, the policy, but then also the transcripts from the focus groups and the interviews to collect statements about how it's spoken about. I'm then, secondly, identifying what the dominant discourses are. So can they be grouped? Are there kind of key groups into which those statements can be sorted? And thirdly, I'm asking what purpose is that particular discourse serving? So that's connected to the 5th stage, which is if those discourses are serving a particular purpose, what action or what kind of things are enabled, what things become possible and what things are made impossible through that. I'm looking less at stages 4 and 6 around identities, although I'll be touching a little bit on that. So then the analysis so I've looked at 6 different texts, so 3 from the Department for Education, 1 local authority document and 2 documents from policy think tanks. And my early archaeological analysis has found 4 key ways in which home education is constructed. The first is as a right or duty or something to be held accountable for. So this includes the rights of parents, as all of you will know, that in England it's the 1996 Education Act that gives parents the legal right to educate their child or children. But also to the duties of the child, the rights of the child. So the rights of the parents is kind of contrasted to the rights of the child. And then also held in tension is the duty of the local authority to look after and to make sure that the child is educated. And Also that idea of something that needs to be held to account, that someone has to be held to account for. There's a lot of talk throughout the policy documentation, which my fellow UK researchers will be familiar with, around the minimum standard of education that is suitable and efficient, without really kind of adequate understanding of what suitable or a minimum standard might actually look like. So local authorities are held to account for making sure that there is a suitable education without having the right, for example, to follow up with home educators. So the second way that it's constructed is that it's something that's unknown, that it's therefore possibly unsuitable, and at worst, it's a risk. And that's actually picking up on something, again, in Harriet's presentation, where she talked about home educators feeling that they were perceived as a risk. It's come through really clearly in the policy analysis I've done, that there is that perception, that there is a risk involved in parents being able to home educate their children. So something that's unknown, something that's unsuitable, and even a risk to the child. So there isn't reliable data because at the moment there isn't a compulsory register in England, and that's taken from strengthening home education that Robert talked about, which leads to this high level of uncertainty. And on the back of that, that's where the calls for increased regulation come. At the same time, it's really clear that through the policy documentation, there's a requirement that we need that data in order for the suitability of the education to be assessed. The other aspect of it is whether the parents themselves are suitable. So that's also part of the discussion. Some parents are considered to be suitable to home educate, some less so because they lack any kind of teaching experience. Some set out to use home education to avoid independent oversight, and some parents, it says, actually actively use home education as a kind of a way in which actually to put their child at risk and to be out of sight of the social services. So that, is a really clear kind of sense of risk there. And there's some more examples of that through those policy documentations. The third construct, the third way that it's constructed, is as a challenge to social and cultural norms. So again, the way that it's talked about throughout the policy documentation is that it is not the choice that most parents make, but it is the legal choice to make. So through the think tank documentation, we actually have some much stronger ways of talking about it. My long-held belief is that school really is the best place for children to be, and that's the start of the document. There's also lots around the importance of citizenship, and actually that there's an implication. The thing that isn't said is that there is a possibility that home education might not provide that ability for children to function as an independent citizen, or that it might conflict with British values. It also it overlaps with discourses around disadvantage and marginalised groups. And there is an implication, again, without it being said directly, that a lack of suitable education is likely to impair the child's development. So the implication is that might actually be a possibility there. It's also presented as a really countercultural phenomenon, and the negative language that's used is really strong. So it's talked about as a growing problem. And it's talked about, it says that you shouldn't view home educators with automatic suspicion, but obviously the implication is that they might be. And also the language that's used is a kind of mildly threatening language through the documents. It's strongly recommended, for example, that you comply with local authority requests to see what you're doing. So there's a kind of subtle discourse of actually needing to comply with the authorities. I'm going to whiz through this because I am quite keen to have a bit of time for questions, because that for me is going to be really helpful and useful. So the fourth construct is around the response to the failing education system. So throughout, there is also an understanding that actually many of the children that are home educated, or an implication that many of the children are home educated, are done. That's what's been chosen for them because the mainstream system hasn't worked for them. So it's related to the rise of children leaving school because their needs are unmet. There's also a bit of blame put onto the schools that they are actually coercing or forcing parents to take on the role of home education, and that there's misinformation that parents are actually doing it unknowingly or through coercion from the school. So my next phase is to analyse the parent discourse and see whether reflections of what I've found through the policy analysis are also then reflected in the way that both parents of school children but also parents of children who are home educated talk about home education. So these are some of my references that I've referenced today, and it would be brilliant to have any questions or challenges or ways that you can kind of steer my next year and a half or 2 years of my doctorate research. Thank you. Thank you.
There we go.
Thank you. I just have one question about your policy discourses. Behind those discourses, did you identify moral entrepreneurs or personalities or administration that within public authorities foster these ways to construct the problem?
There's a moral...
Are there people that you identify fostering this way to frame the problem? You know, because you have 6 texts,
Yeah.
but who wrote the text?
Right, sorry, yeah. So who are the
fostered
authors of the
idea?
text? That's a really, really good question. And certainly the ones from the Department for Education have no author attached. So they're guidelines written by the Department for Education, but written by civil servants. So in a way, the kind of anonymity, I think, kind of almost doesn't allow you to interrogate in quite the same way who it is that's written it, because it's just written by the state, if you like, by the civil service. The think tanks are the Centre for Social Justice and also the Children's Commissioner Office, where you can actually look at who the authors are and look at other writings and see if there's overlapping discourse and whether things, for example, around safeguarding are becoming clearer through their documentation. But that's it. Thank you.
So it was just a suggestion to go beyond this anonymity and this black box of the state, just to identify who fostered these discourses within the administration.
Yeah, particularly because we've got a new government in England. Yeah.
One more question.
Thank you, Bea. So the question I had is, this, for my experience, is the first time looking at policy discourse, which is really good. Parental discourse in the UK or England specifically, we have quite a bit of research of that. So to look at how they communicate and how they express, home education is really good. Have you thought about, that's my field, the voices of the young people to see their discourse on home education? Is there space? Maybe not 2 years, maybe 3 years of PhD added to your study to see what their perspective is?
Yeah, I think that would be a really interesting next phase. I think, there are multiple discourses and ways that you can look at them overlapping and reflecting one another or being resistant to one another. And so I have to narrow down for the purposes of this, but I think certainly, thinking about the other presentations we've had around metaphors of learning and things, it would be really interesting to tie that in to see whether it's seen as, for example, a risk or, whether it overlaps with some of the policy or expert discourse. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Join me in thanking. Our next presenter is Rachael Barrow. She comes to us from Lancaster University, and she's a researcher, I believe also a lecturer there as well, and has done work on transitions. Welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm a bit tall, sorry, to move the microphone. Yes, so I'm Rachael, and I have just finished my PhD back in March. So I'm currently doing the corrections. I can't tell you how happy I am that it's over. It was 6 years for me, and that was full time. So it was very much a slog. So I just wanted to start with my background a little bit and tell you why I came to this research in the first place. So I was previously home educated between the ages of 11 to 19. So the reason behind that was I hated school the whole time I was there. So I did primary and I was having issues. I went to 4 different primary schools in what would have been like a 8-9 year period. Even the teachers were an issue because I was being bullied by the teachers as well as other students. And my dad had gone through similar things when he was at school. So he pretty much said to me, hey, do you want to try this? Do you want to see if it works? And it seemed to work. So we carried on doing it. But when I kind of got to the workplace, I thought, you know what, I feel a bit different here. It wasn't just that I felt different in how I thought about things or how I approached things. It was the issues with things like authority, with the structures, having to be in at 9 o'clock in the morning when I'm not used to that. As someone said before, we sleep a lot. So I was quite happy to stay in bed. And yeah, especially things like organizational politics, and that came out a lot in this research. We don't, as I say, and this is going to come out as well about positionality, like Robert was saying, because I tend to say we a lot because I forget that in some roles I'm the researcher and it's not about my personal opinion. But as home educated people, I lost my trail of thought then. Yes, politics, thank you. Yeah, we tend not to engage so much in that kind of aspect of it. We don't really engage in the bitchiness you see on the playground, in the bullying that happens, in the going behind people's backs and things like that you then find in the workplace again. And so when I went and looked at the literature while I was doing my master's, I'd noticed that in the UK, really there was only Julie Webb's study back in 1989 as her dissertation for her doctorate that actually looked at what do people do when they go to work and employment. In the United States, there is a few more studies on that. So notably, Ray had a look at what people did when they went on after being home educated. Deani did some work out of Canada on what people did 15 years later, etc. So they were my sort of starting place with this. So both from the personal aspect and from what didn't exist in the literature, I thought it was really important to look at people who were home educated and find out how did they experience work and employment, but from their own voices, from their perspectives. I didn't want to impose anything. So today I just want to talk to you briefly about the PhD project and give you some information on the methodology. But I kind of wanted to focus on the findings because I think that's probably what you're more interested in than anything. So, yeah. So, as I've already said, I was looking at this group of people who are typically seen as residing outside of the norm. If you ask most mainstream people, we're a little bit weird because we're doing something that they don't understand. And so the starting position was kind of this idea that we have a shared absence of the field of school. And I use the term field because I look at Bordeaux's concepts of his theory of practice, where he talks about habitus, capital, and field. So I see I see education as a field, school as sort of a subfield. Therefore, home education in its own right should be seen as a subfield. And so that's where I kind of started thinking about, well, if you go to school, the idea is you're being prepared for work. You go through this system and then it reproduces. So is that the same for people who've been home educated? Does home education reproduce in some workplaces? And where it doesn't and it's school that's reproduced, then does that cause problems for a home educated person? So my argument is that while we can't generalize people's experiences of home education, we can't say we all have the exact same experience just because we were home educated. What could be argued is that we share this collective habitus in some ways. We have shared experiences of the same phenomenon, even if that is individualized along the way. And I've already touched on this second point, But the idea is that in a subfield of home education, we have ways of accruing capital that we can use to transition into employment with, just as you would if you went to school. It might just not look the same. So a lot of my participants would talk about qualifications. Some of them would say, you know, I don't see the point in it. Why do I need a piece of paper to prove what I can do? Like when I was being home educated, I didn't have to prove anything to my parents who, you know, might have been the tutors. There was none of that. I mean, for some, if they were in different countries, they might have had to do testing and things like that. But in the UK, sometimes, depending on the local authority, you might have to turn over some work that you've done, but typically you're sort of just left to it. So yeah, that was kind of the theoretical side. So empirically, with my methodology, as people have already discussed today, I went down the narrative route because I thought it was important in trying to understand people's voices on this, for them to tell their life histories on home education and employment through stories. So the eldest participant I had was 55 years old. So as you can imagine, they had lots of stories about being in different jobs, different types of employment, different colleagues they'd encountered, and some of those were positive, some were negative. But I think the main thing to get across there is there was complexity. So there was no one participant who had a perfect journey the whole way through. It wasn't always, this is the best thing I've ever done. Oh, and then that was the best thing I ever done. Or, you know, going to work was the worst thing I ever done and it never improved. It all stayed the same. There was none of that. There was very much this up and down, like a roller coaster of experiences. So touching on that, yes, I did life history interviews because I wanted to be able to connect the two. One of my research questions was, do home educated people feel like their home education was significant for their experiences of work and employment? So I wanted to know if they saw a connection, rather than assume that you were home educated, you must have had an issue in work or it must have been advantageous to you. And coming back to what Robert was talking about positionality, it was important that I acknowledged that in the thesis because of being so close to the data. And also I personally knew some of my participants. So there is a huge section on that as well. These, there's two of them. I don't know whether you can read them. I'm going to explain what they are. So in every interview I did, this was my form of shorthand. So they're called timelines in the literature. And in the far bottom corner, it says something along the lines of primary school. And as I would move along like a mind map by what people were telling me in the interviews. And I used these as a way to, as you'll see with the stickers, it made sense to me about what was really important that they were conveying, so I could ask them questions after they'd finished narrating. Because how I did my interviews was I just asked them to talk to me. So from any age that they wanted to start, whatever they felt was significant about any type of education, mainly home education, through their work histories, to just tell me it all and everything in between, because I didn't want to make the assumptions. And this is what visually that looked like. I'm going to skip over this because I've already discussed it. So this was the sort of spread of employment I wanted to show you, to just demonstrate that there wasn't just one industry here. I didn't just interview people from sales, but the highlighting is to demonstrate how in yellow, these are the things that people said they hated doing. These were the industries they never wanted to work in again. And there was different reasons for this, but usually it was because of how they were treated. So in sales, they were asked to go against the moral values that were very prominent during their home education, having to sell things to people at a higher price, having to pretend that things were a certain way, and they didn't get on with that. One participant said that she did cold calling on the phone, and she would spend her lunch break crying in the shower because that was just fundamentally against who she was as a person. And then she would connect that back to her home education, that, this way of behaving and treating other people was not something that was fostered during her home education. The ones in like a burgundy colour were the ones that were preferred career tracks. There was a lot of people who went into academia to do research, not just on home education, just generally research, and they felt that that's because when they were home educating, they were around books a lot, they enjoyed reading things, they were always inquisitive because they'd been outdoors learning, they'd learned all different subjects, and so that carried through into what they did as a job. And charity work as well was on there, and there was a lot of self-employed people, as I want to say you might imagine, to avoid those kind of reproduced structures that you get in a lot of corporate workplaces that mimic that they would have experienced at school. So now I'm going to talk about some of the findings. I must say that this is just a few of them. There were so many, they weren't fitting into 20 minutes. And I have 2 analysis chapters in my thesis, so this is just from one of them. So in answering one of the main research questions about the significance of home education, the stories highlighted how the respondents have not forgotten their personal experience of home education, irrespective of how long ago they happened. The opposite was found because they strongly remembered who they were when they were being home educated and connected that to their identities, which I felt was really significant. A lot of backlash I got when I was doing this because I'm in a management school full of people who've been to school. So the backlash I would always get is, why should we care about these people's experiences? They're such a minority. Why should we care? And then the other part of that was, well, you were home educated, of course you care. And then I remember my reviewer early on said to me, how do you know that they even remember being home educated? It was so long ago. They probably don't even remember. They probably don't care now. And so I spent the past 6 years trying to prove that actually it's so significant of a time because it's beyond just education. It's a whole way of life when you're being home educated. And that comes out in the data, people saying, you know, it's a lifestyle for me. So it was significant. So if I just move forward to a quote. So this was Naomi. She was home educated for 12 years and she was in ballet education. She had her own dance theatre. And so she said, yeah, I think probably everything comes back to my home education. I sometimes sit and think, wondering what my life would be now if I'd stayed in school. I compare myself to some of my peers that I've stayed in touch with, and I kind of have a rough idea where my life would have taken me. You think I'd be happy? I don't think I'd be happy. I mean, I was smart, so I would have done well with my GCSEs, would have given me a good base in which to do my A-levels. Then I would have gone to a good university, got a good job, but I would probably have been working loads of hours in a job that maybe I didn't enjoy because of that conventional path. I'd never see my children. I probably wouldn't have met my boyfriend. And yeah, I just think every decision I've made has been influenced by my childhood. And I think this is the really important point now. And I say my childhood because I think home education isn't an educational choice, but it's a way of life. It's not like that. It's not like, oh, you're going to school or you're going to be home educated. You know, it's not quite like that. And I think it's just a whole way of living and existing in the world. Yeah, I'd definitely say every single decision I've made to date has been influenced by it. And I think that's really a powerful quote because I think a lot of people around the room probably can empathize with that, whether it was you yourself or it was your children, that no matter what you chose to do in this world, whether it was just work and employment or just generally who you got married to or who your friends were, all of it was influenced by education. And I guess we could say that could be true of schooled people as well. My study wasn't to compare, so I don't want to make that leap. But yeah, I thought that was a really good quote. So one of the most interesting findings, and I was really excited about this, is the amount of participants that would talk about school, even if they didn't go to school. It was their perceptions of what school was like or what school would have done to them. Some did go to school, so there was a mixture in there. Some were in school for 2, 4, 6 years. Some were home educated their whole lives. But haunting was a huge part of when they got to work in employment. And by haunting, from a literature standpoint, haunting is this idea that a ghost is following you around. And so they would talk about haunting in the workplace from a positive and negative perspective. So for some, haunting was very negative. So as Tom is saying here, he's comparing what happened in school to what he was finding in the workplace. So it's the same kind of environment. It's the same principle of school. You go to school for 6 hours a day. Within 1 2-hour lesson, you say, your work's all done in 45 minutes. But then you're made to stay sat in that classroom, twiddling your thumbs until everyone catches up. You can't go outside, you can't take a walk, you can't talk to the teacher or the other pupils, you can't go home. All you're physically allowed to do is sit there and go over your work. It's the exact same logic that you find in work, the exact same rules and nonsense that just repeats itself, but now you're in an adult environment. You have a form teacher, a head of year, you have the team leader, the line manager. It's like school is a game, and if you play by its rules, then you get on just fine. But if you contest the rules and you reject what's deemed as normal, then you are out. There's swearing coming, I'm sorry. The problem is when you get to work and the fucking game starts all over again. It's like a ghost following you around to haunt you forever. I'm going to move on because I'm running out of time. But the point is, you can see that when they got to work, it was this idea of school that was haunting them. It wasn't the home education that was haunting them, because as I'll show you in a second, this also Tom, but this was haunting as positive, because he talks about when he was home educating his daughter, because he saw that as a form of employment at that time, although he wasn't paid. He found that it was the best gift he ever gave himself, because he was able to transform his abilities, pursue what really interested him. It gave him hope that he thought there might not be hope for the future after getting into a spot of bother after he started to home educate her. It was incredible. All the memories came flooding back to him. He was being haunted by his own experience of self-educating himself when he was younger, and by home educating his daughter, that for him was a more positive experience of being employed, even if it was self-employment that wasn't paid. So he took himself out of formal work to do this, because that was how he coped. And just to go back here, when haunting becomes too much, that's what happened to Sean as well. So he saw this link between the school system and work, and he decided he was going to become an entrepreneur. And now he does maths tutoring for the home education community, because again, he didn't want to be haunted by this ghost that was negative. He wanted to be haunted by his positive experiences of being home educated. I'm not going to have time to get through all these, but just very quickly, othering was another one of the significant findings. The participants othered themselves, they othered the school colleagues, and they would also, sorry, I forgot my third one. They othered themselves, they othered their managers, they were othered, sorry, by their managers and colleagues, and they othered their school colleagues. David was othered in a positive way because the manager had spotted he was a bit different how he approached things, and so he rewarded him for that, and he wanted him to excel, because the people coming from school, the manager felt that actually they weren't very good at the job, whereas the home educated person he was seeing actually was doing what he wanted an employee to be doing. Arthur was interesting because he was a trainee vicar, and during the interview they asked him about his own home education and said they thought that he couldn't be a vicar because his education wasn't normal, when the church is meant to be a place for everybody who might not be normal or are normal. So there was this huge degree of othering happening in the data. I'm very happy to share this if anybody wants it, because I ran out of time. I don't know if we're allowed to do that, but by all means do contact me if you'd like to know more. And yeah, just to conclude that the main thing I want people to take away from this is not just that we finally have some research on people who are home educated and are in work and employment, but how complex it is and how varied it is, that it's not always positive, but it's not always negative. And there is a huge degree, even within one individual's career trajectory, of positive and negatives. But all of them, I had 31 participants, all of them felt that being home educated was significant for their work and employment experiences. Thank you.
Do we have a question for Rachael?
Thanks for that. That was really interesting. I just wanted to ask, did any of the participants talk about, difficulty in getting employed in the first place, or periods of where they felt they were underemployed because employers look for traditional qualifications, and whether that impacted then their perception of the workplace when they did get there?
Yeah, so it's not in the PowerPoint, but one of the findings was around qualifications because of the emphasis on accruing capital. There was just one participant who really felt like he was at a disadvantage from being home educated, because his education, he ended up going through like an adult education type thing at a college to do a counselling degree. But in that particular profession, you need to do it at a reasonably professional university. That's not the route to do it in. And so he had a lot of issues trying to get work in that industry because his degree wasn't valued, because it was a home educated person who'd gone to adult night school. But most of them I interviewed didn't have issues. Some of them had qualifications, some didn't. Where they didn't, they just improvised. They used the skills they'd got from home education to actually just be like, hey, look at me, these are my skills, I can do this. There was a lot around an entrepreneurial spirit when it came to qualifications. They just improvised. Thank you.
I'm sorry there isn't time for more questions.
That's fine.
Dr. Barrow, congratulations on receiving your degree, and thank you for the presentation. Will you please join with me in thanking Harriet, Robert, B, and Rachael for a very informative session. And please do seek them out with any further follow-up questions and time for connection. And to our real host.
Okay. Thank you. So we have a quick break now, and in 15 minutes, I invite you to return here, and we're going to have a panel discussion about the research community working with the homeschool community. So really looking forward to the next session. Thank you once again, and thank you, Deani, so much for moderating. Excellent. All right.